Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Julian, Rome's Last Pagan Emperor, by Philip Freeman, narrated by Jonathan Johns. Prologue. A cold wind was blowing fiercely down from the mountains that late November, in the year 361, when two towering Germans marched unexpectedly into the palace at Nisch, where the rebellious young Caesar, the title of a junior emperor, was plotting his next move against the ruler of the Roman Empire. Julian hated the rough-hewn city near the wild Danube frontier, far from the cultured cities of Greece where he felt most at home. But the fortified town was the key to guarding the borders against the barbarian, Frankish and Germanic tribes of the north that had threatened the empire since the days of the great Augustus, more than 3 centuries earlier. It was also the fastest road for his journey from his assigned province of Gaul through the Balkans and over the Suchi Pass before arrival at Constantinople, the new and thriving capital of the greatest empire the Mediterranean world had ever known. But Julian hated Nisch most of all, because it was forever celebrated as the birthplace of his uncle, Constantine the Great. He could scarcely go anywhere in the town without seeing some statue dedicated to the man who had dared deny the ancient gods of Greece and Rome, and embraced the cult of a Jewish carpenter and his ragtag band of Galilean fishermen, a religion, in the opinion of Julian, though himself raised as a faithful Christian, fit only for slaves and fools. Needless to say, as a member of the most powerful Christian family in the world, he had kept his beliefs to himself. The 2 German soldiers who appeared before him, surrounded by imperial guards that day, were named Theolaphus and Aligildus, known to Julian as loyal senior officers of his enemy and cousin, Constantius. They caused Julian no alarm, as he had commanded and fought against such men for the past few years in Gaul in the service of the emperor. Julian had been sent with the title of Caesar to the western edge of the empire to fly the imperial flag and show the populace that their emperor supposedly cared so deeply for their safety that he was placing his own kinsmen among them to protect them against the fierce Germans from across the Rhine. Never mind that half the soldiers and officers in the Roman legions of Gaul were themselves Germans, who fought for gold against their relatives across the river. Constantius did not bother to note that Julian was just a philosophy student in his early 20s who knew about battles only from books. The important thing in the eyes of the emperor was that his cousin was a member of the royal family, and so a visible reminder to the Gauls of their faraway emperor's love for them. And of course no one at court mentioned that Julian was chosen because Constantius had murdered everyone else he was related to by blood, including Julian's father and brother. But Julian was full of surprises. A natural general and leader of men, he had driven back the Germans and proven such a success that his own men had proclaimed him co-emperor with Constantius while he was busy fighting the Persians on the eastern frontier. Julian's tepid denials that he had ever wanted such equal standing did not impress his older cousin, so the two were now marching from opposite directions across the empire towards civil war, though few wagered on the success of Julian against the vastly larger army, greater experience, and utter ruthlessness of Constantius. It was thus a shock when the 2 Germans, clearly exhausted from days of hard riding, fell to their knees before Julian and held up a golden crown. The story they told was even more surprising. They had been with Constantius fighting on the Persian frontier when the emperor had driven back their forces and forged an uneasy peace in order to turn his attention to his treacherous Caesar in the west. His goal was to race Julian to Constantinople and crush him before he could approach the capital. He had marched his veteran soldiers quickly through the city of Antioch and then quickly on to Tarsus, birthplace of the Christian apostle Paul. But the omens were troubling, even for a Christian such as Constantius. For example, when he saw a headless man on the road outside Tarsus stretched out toward the west, he was unsure whether the man foretold the fate of himself or of Julian. At Tarsus, Constantius pressed on, even when he came down with a mild fever. Upward through the mountains of Cilicia, he continued until he soon fell deathly ill at the base of the snow-covered Taurus Mountains. His body grew so hot it could not be touched, while remedies applied by the finest physicians proved useless. Knowing that he had little time left, Constantius asked for a deathbed baptism to wash away his sins at the last moments of life. The two Germans swore that his final words had been to declare Julian his legitimate successor. The former philosophy student and secret pagan, only 30 years of age, and the last surviving relative of the holy Christian emperor Constantine the Great, was now the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. Few figures from ancient times have captured the modern imagination like Flavius Claudius Julianus, better known as Julian the Apostate. He ruled Rome for just over a year and a half, but during that short span he threatened to turn the world upside down. Although a nephew of the first Christian emperor of Rome, Julian soon openly abandoned his family's faith and fought to return Rome to the old gods, who had led his ancestors to build one of the greatest empires the world had ever known. His efforts ultimately failed, but for almost 1700 years, his admirers had seen him as a tragic and quixotic figure, a lonely hero raging against the dying light of pagan civilization. Christian writers and historians from his own time forward have seen Julian in a very different way, as a traitor to God and violent oppressor of those who followed the true faith. Like most famous people from history, Julian was neither as ideal as his supporters would have us believe, nor as monstrous as his enemies portray him. He was above all a complicated man, who in his short reign blazed like a comet across the sky of late antiquity. That he failed in his efforts to hold back the inrushing tide of Christianity is not surprising, but his lack of success should not distract us from his remarkable accomplishments as a skilled general, masterful administrator, and gifted writer. If not for a lucky Persian, or was it a Roman, spear on a distant battlefield, Julian might have ruled the empire for decades and accomplished everything he set out to do. But we would be living in a very different world from the one we know today. How can we form an accurate picture of such a controversial man who lived so long ago? As it happens, in contrast to the paucity of sources for many key figures of late Roman times, an abundance of documentation survives for the short life of Julian, including the writings of Julian himself, detailed descriptions of the emperor by his friends and enemies, preserved legal decrees, contemporary inscriptions, and even coinage minted under him. But as is so often the case in shaping the story of a person from the past, each of these sources must be approached with caution, and none can be trusted completely. The surviving letters, satires, hymns, and other works composed by Julian are of the greatest importance and constitute a key resource for understanding the life and mind of the emperor. Few figures from antiquity, apart from Cicero, give us a clearer view of both their public and their private lives in their writings. Some of these compositions, such as Julian's gushing panegyric praising the Emperor Constantius, were formulaic works that were never meant to be read as sincere, but they nonetheless provide a great deal of biographical information about Julian's early life as he struggled to survive in the violent world of the Roman imperial court. His letters to Athens and other Greek cities in which he tried to justify his revolt against Constantius are more revealing about his true feelings, as well as his motives for civil war. His Misopogon, Beard Hater, is a scolding attack on the ungrateful people of Antioch, disguised as a self-satire that reveals Julian in one of his worst moments as a prickly ruler who has lost his patience with an entire city. The full text of his powerful anti-Christian tract against the Galileans was lost in antiquity, but much was preserved in extensive quotations within an early Christian response by Cyril of Alexandria. Two of Julian's hymns to the gods, however, did survive the centuries, and reveal a person of deep religious faith and spiritual sensibility. But it is, unsurprisingly, in his personal letters that we are able to see most clearly the private Julian, with all his strengths and weaknesses. They are a treasure for any biographer. Taken as a whole, the writings of Julian are of tremendous value, since they present an amazingly clear portrait of the man, though, as with any of us, authors are not always the truest sources or most balanced critics of their own lives. Two of the best contemporary commentators on his life are a sympathetic pagan professor and a hostile Christian bishop, both of whom knew him personally. Libanius, from the Greek city of Antioch in Syria, was a celebrated teacher of rhetoric and a prominent public figure, respected across the religious spectrum. He became a friend and ardent supporter of Julian, composing, among other works, a funeral oration for the emperor that gives us a detailed outline of his life and goals. Libanius is a faithful presenter of the facts about Julian, and trustworthy in his information, but deliberately selective and careful to include only the flattering aspects of his career. Equally informative, though holding very different religious views, Gregory of Nazianzus in Cappadocia was a schoolmate of Julian's in Athens, and later an influential Christian bishop. Although a faithful Christian, he was deeply immersed in the Hellenic, literary, and philosophical tradition he shared with the emperor. His writings on his former friend are passionately antagonistic, but generally reliable in their details about his life. One of the most promising sources for the life of Julian is the detailed history of Ammianus Marcellinus, a native of Antioch, who nonetheless wrote in Latin and became the last of the great Roman historians. Ammianus was a career military officer who served in Gaul when Julian was a mere Caesar, and later participated in the emperor's disastrous invasion of Persia, though he was never personally close to him. He was a confirmed pagan, a measured opponent of Christianity, and an admirer of Julian, though unafraid to criticize the excesses of the emperor's campaign to restore traditional Roman religion. His balanced year-by-year account of the reign of Julian would seem an ideal source for discovering his story, and indeed is invaluable, but Ammianus composed his history decades after Julian's death, often from secondary sources, and was sometimes more interested in style than substance. Nonetheless, the account of Ammianus is crucial for forming an accurate picture of Julian. Other ancient accounts are also valuable, such as the now lost history of the pagan writer Eunapius, who drew on another lost work by Julian's closest friend and physician, Oribasius. Eunapius was often paraphrased by the late 5th century Greek historian Zosimus in his own work, portions of which do survive. Later Christian writers, such as Ephrem of Nisbis, who reviled Julian, nonetheless preserve some valuable information about him and give a crucial Christian perspective to his actions. Other later writers had access to works about Julian we no longer possess, and can be useful to our understanding of the emperor. Remaining sources which are helpful for forming a clearer picture of Julian include the Theodosian Code, which contains the texts of imperial decrees issued by Julian, along with inscriptions carved at the time of the emperor and coins, often an important medium for imperial propaganda. All in all, we have abundant, yet at times frustratingly contradictory sources for a biography of Julian. Weighing them all carefully and arriving at the clearest picture we can is the challenge faced by historians and readers alike. But when we make the effort, we can discover one of the most fascinating people in history. Chapter 1. A Cross in the Sky. Julian was born in the year 331 into an ambitious, murderous, and thoroughly Christian family. The city of his birth was Constantinople, founded a few years earlier as the new Roman capital by his uncle Constantine, and dedicated to the glory of Jesus Christ. The fact that Julian, as emperor, would become one of the greatest enemies the church had ever known would have shocked his family, if any of them had survived long enough to see him take the throne. No one would have been more disappointed and angrier at Julian than Constantine himself, the man who 2 decades before his nephew's birth had become the first Christian emperor of Rome. Constantine's embrace of the new faith had profound implications for the future of the empire, all the more because Christianity was still a divided and struggling sect that had won over no more than a small minority of the population in the 3 centuries since it had been established in a poor and troubled corner of the Roman world. The Romans always had a grudging respect for the Jews because of their ancient traditions and disciplined morality. However, this did not stop Roman legions from making war on the Jews and enforcing a harsh and brutal peace in Palestine. Violence was commonplace, and rebellion against Roman authority was met with a swift and merciless response. It was in this troubled land that Yeshua bar Yosef, known later as Jesus, conducted his brief ministry as a traveling rabbi and healer. When he was crucified in Jerusalem under the Roman governor Pontius Pilate during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, he was dismissed as yet another rebel who would soon be forgotten. But to the small group of his Jewish followers who claimed he had risen from the dead, he was divine. Starting in Jerusalem, they spread their new religion, which grew and was soon embraced by non-Jews through the efforts of wandering missionaries, such as Paul of Tarsus, who established communities of Christians in towns and cities around the Mediterranean and beyond. The followers of Jesus met in the homes of the new wealthy members of local congregations for fellowship, instruction, and a sacred meal, practices that reflected a pattern common to many religious groups of the time. But unlike adherents of many other sacred organizations, the Christians were known for welcoming women and slaves into their community, as well as for their acts of public, universal charity in a world in which the untended poor routinely starved to death. But Christians soon ran into trouble with the government for their refusal to sacrifice to the emperor and the gods of Rome. This was not a spiritual failing in the eyes of the Romans, who tended to be tolerant of religious differences among their subjects, but an act of civil rebellion against the emperor that threatened the harmony of the larger community. The failure to sacrifice to the emperor was tantamount to rejecting the authority that held civilization together in a hostile world. In the early 2nd century, Pliny the Younger, who was serving as Roman governor of Bithynia in Asia Minor, wrote to his friend the Emperor Trajan for advice on how to punish Christians brought before him on trial for impiety. Trajan's response set the tone for Roman officials for the next 2 centuries. The Christians are not to be sought out by the authorities. However, if they are denounced and proven guilty, they should be punished. But whoever who is willing to deny publicly that he is a Christian and proves it by worshipping our gods, even though he was under suspicion in the past, shall be pardoned because of his repentance. For the most part, Christians were allowed to live in peace throughout the empire, even if they did not sacrifice to the gods. Persecution was sporadic and often initiated locally by a few zealous governors, hoping to impress the emperor with their diligence, rather than by any broad mandate from Rome. There were notable Christian martyrs from time to time in Gaul, Asia Minor, Africa, and Rome itself, but the followers of Jesus were generally permitted to worship their God without interference, as Christianity was one of many competing cults in the great marketplace of religious pluralism that was the Roman Empire. Officials tended to ignore them as long as they were discreet and paid their taxes. The Christian communities, for their part, went about quiet lives, led by their local bishops and welcoming anyone who was interested into their fellowship. It was the crisis of the 3rd century that set the stage for the revolution that was to come. Throughout that long and painful century, Rome was beset by countless problems, including invasions by foreign tribes, plague and other diseases, economic collapse, and endless imperial coups and rebellions that almost destroyed the empire. Some rulers sought to restore the stability of Rome by enforcing uniformity of religion among their citizens. The Emperor Decius in 250 ordered everyone in the Roman Empire to sacrifice to the gods in front of a panel of local officials and receive a certificate for doing so. Many of the Christians who refused were punished or even executed, though with the ascension of a new emperor a decade later, the rules were eased. The rise of the Emperor Diocletian at the end of the 3rd century brought about the last and fiercest of the persecutions against the Christians. Diocletian was not by nature cruel or a fanatically religious person, but he was passionately dedicated to restoring Rome to its former glory. One way he attempted this was to divide the governance of the empire between two senior rulers, called Augusti, and two junior rulers known as Caesars, with himself as the dominant Augustus. His hope was that the Caesars would smoothly step into the role of senior emperors when the Augusti retired. He also transformed the court of the emperor by adding elaborate Persian-style ceremonies to elevate the sovereign far above the common people and instill awe in his subjects. But his most notable reform was to firmly suppress any religious movement that he saw as a threat to the traditional values and gods that had made Rome great. First among these supposedly dangerous cults was Manichaeism, a Persian import with adherents throughout the empire, but he also took aim at the Christians and issued edicts to burn their scriptures, demolish their places of assembly, and ban their worship services. He renewed the earlier demand for universal sacrifice to the gods as proof of loyalty, declared Christians of free birth in the imperial service were stripped of rank, and those who were freedmen were returned to slavery. But not all of Diocletian's fellow rulers shared his interest in hunting down Christians. The Caesar for the far west of the empire, a practical general named Flavius Valerius Constantius, contented himself with knocking down a few churches. As always, most of the anti-Christian persecutions took place in the more populated, richer eastern part of the realm, where Christianity had spread more widely. Aside from having little interest in religious persecution, Constantius, later known as Chlorus, was far too busy trying to hold Britain and Gaul for the empire to waste military resources on hunting down Christians. The Germans across the Rhine were a constant threat to Gaul, and Saxon raiders were repeatedly attacking the coast of Britain, while Picts and Scots descended on the Romans across Hadrian's Wall from the north and from Ireland to the west. Constantius spent much of his time in the walled city of York, the northernmost town of the Roman Empire, coordinating the defense of the island, while his fellow rulers denied him the resources he needed for fear he might lead his army south or east against them. Early in his career, Constantius Chlorus had married a common innkeeper named Helena, who bore him a son, Constantine. But when he rose in power, he divorced Helena and took Theodora, a woman of the nobility, as his new wife. Theodora in turn gave birth to a son named Julius Constantius, who got along well enough with his older half-brother, Constantine. 5 other children from Theodora added to the rapidly growing family. The tangle of step-parents and half-siblings may have made the relations of Constantius Chlorus hard for the common people to keep straight, but it was a typical blended family of the Roman upper class, whose male members were usually willing to give up one wife if a better connected woman came along. But for the coming years at least, the ties of loyalty among the children and grandchildren, including Julian, of Constantius Chlorus, and the need for unity against outside threats, would keep at bay the murderous infighting endemic to Roman ruling families that stretched back to Romulus slaying his brother Remus. Constantine, the eldest son of Constantius Chlorus, was born in the town of Nish in the Balkans, not far from the turbulent border of the empire. When his father was chosen by Diocletian as Caesar for Gaul and Britain, the 21-year-old Constantine remained behind in the service of Diocletian as a military tribune and hostage for the good behavior of his father. He was a skilled soldier and fought enthusiastically on battlefields across the empire, from Persia to the Danube. Contrary to all expectations, Diocletian retired peacefully from his role as senior emperor in 305, and handed the office of Jul Augusti to his Caesars Galerius in the east as senior Augustus, and Constantius as his junior in the west, after forcing his fellow Augustus, Maximian, to retire as well. Before Galerius could find an excuse to hold him, Constantine left for Britain to help his father defend the island against the Picts. Constantine was thus present at York the next year, when his father, Constantius, suddenly died. The legions in Britain had admired Constantius as a good general and saw the same qualities in his son. Though he was only in his early 30s, the troops proclaimed him as Augustus, an act that in the past that had often led to civil war. Galerius, the senior Augustus ruling in the east, was occupied by other problems and contented himself with a stern rebuke, recognizing young Constantine as Caesar only, and giving the title of Augustus in the west to his comrade Severus. Constantine spent the next few years based at the key Roman fortress of Trier, on the Rhine border between Gaul and Germany. He honed his skills as a general and administrator, while building a network of supporters throughout the empire for the fight for power and survival he knew would soon come. Only a year after taking office as Augustus in the west, Galerius's ally Severus was overthrown and executed by Maxentius, the son of the previous emperor Maximian, who claimed the title of Augustus for himself in Rome. He also invited his father to join him, shattering the fragile system of succession that Diocletian had established. Galerius invaded Italy to drive Maxentius out, but failed, instead appointing a comrade named Licinius as a rival Augustus, along with a general named Maximinius. Maximian soon eclipsed his son in Italy, and he strengthened his position further when he made an alliance with Constantine, naming him Augustus in Gaul and giving him his daughter Fausta in marriage. Maxentius in turn then drove his overbearing father out of Italy, forcing Maximian to find shelter with Constantine at his Gaulish court. By this point, even the most informed citizens across the empire were having trouble keeping track of who was in charge. Constantine spent the next few years defending the Rhine frontier and quarreling with Galerius, but managing to avoid an outright civil war. He fought bravely against the Franks and bridged the Rhine to launch punishing raids into Germany. In 310, while he was fighting the Germans, Constantine received reports that his ally, the former Emperor Maximian, was trying to regain power, prompting Constantine to turn on him and force him to commit suicide. When Galerius died the next year, his protégés, Maximinius and Licinius, barely avoided civil war by dividing the empire between themselves, leaving Constantine temporarily marginalized, but willing to make an alliance with Licinius against Maximinius. In 312, when Constantine was 39, he finally made his move. With the consent of Licinius, he invaded Italy and successfully faced the forces of Maximinius in the Po Valley before moving on to Rome. There in late October, at a place known as Saxa Rubra, just north of the city, he met Maximinius, defeating and killing his rival at the Milvian Bridge over the Tiber River. Under pressure from Constantine, the Senate in Rome prudently recognized his new standing and officially named him as Augustus. With Britain, Gaul, Spain, Italy, and Africa under his rule, Constantine became the most powerful man in the Western Roman Empire. It was at the Milvian Bridge that, according to later stories, a miracle occurred. Constantine had never been an especially religious man, but like many Romans, and particularly those in the army, he paid homage to Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, often merged in worship with the god Apollo. Many Christians saw the sun as a symbol of Christ, though their bishops repeatedly warned them not to confuse the celestial creation of God with the Creator. Roman generals were forever declaring visions of victory to their men on the eve of battle to boost their morale. In the past, Constantine had told his army that he had seen the sun god Apollo and the goddess Victory, along with the symbol XXX, to indicate the 30 years of rule the god had granted him. Before the conflict at the Milvian Bridge, he reported to his soldiers that he had a dream in which he was told that his men should put a cross on their shields. This could have been the Chi symbol from the first two letters of the name of Christ in Greek, though it might as easily have been the start of the Greek word Christos, luck. There is no indication in the earliest sources on the battle that the symbol was intended to be a Christian cross, but by the time Constantine was an old man, the story had evolved in...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?